Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So, here's a question for you. If the courts keep knocking back attempts to muzzle the media, can democracy still, lose the fight for free speech? What does media failure even look like when it isn't an outright ban, but more like a slow squeeze, a kind of intimidation?
Yeah, that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? The current tension with the American press. We hear the optimistic take quite often, right? That someone powerful like Donald Trump, for instance, uses these really formidable tactics, lawsuits, threats, ownership moves. But in the end, the story goes, the First Amendment and America's, messy media landscape mean he'll ultimately fail.
And look, that's definitely a comforting thought. But I think today we need to look past that headline and we need to dig into the details, look at the specific tools being used, the lawsuits, the ownership strategies, and figure out where the legal wins for the press stop and where the more subtle, maybe corrosive effects of influence really start. Because let's be honest, losing a court case doesn't automatically mean you failed to exert political influence, right? Okay, but let's start with the positives. Because there is real resistance. The system, at least legally, seems to be pushing back. We've seen late-night hosts like Jimmy Kimmel, for instance, write out campaigns to get them off air. But the really big one, surely, was that federal judge just, laughing that huge $15 billion defamation suit against the New York Times out of court. That was quite something.
It was. And it shows pretty clearly how the courts and the First Amendment framework, they do act as this strong, maybe slow, but definite backstop against direct legal censorship anyway. But the optimism you mentioned, the one the article talks about, it's really grounded in the fundamental structure of the U.S. media market itself. It's described as sprawling and unruly.
Right. Not like, say, Italy under Berlusconi or maybe Orban's Hungary, where media power means controlling just a few key national outlets.
Exactly. In the U.S., a lot of the political heat is aimed at traditional broadcast news. But honestly, that's becoming less central. The big media conglomerates, they're much more focused on the streaming wars now. And the data backs this up. Outside of election debates, CBS is the main political source for only, 3% of Americans? So the political anger is focused on an area that's actually shrinking in importance.
And the digital world is just as chaotic, which you'd think would also be a shield.
It generally is. I mean, social media is incredibly fragmented. It's not like the old days where a politician could just ring up an editor and, dictate terms. Plus, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they have pretty limited power over the actual platforms. So yet this sheer fragmentation, this lack of central control points, is the big structural reason why getting total control is seen as basically impossible in the U.S.
Okay, that makes sense. The fortress walls are high, the landscape inside is complicated, hard to dominate completely. But if they keep losing the big legal fights and the structure is so robust, how are political actors still managing to, undermine journalism? Where's the actual harm?
And that's a critical point, isn't it? The legal strength can actually mask a successful shift in tactics. The idea that he'll fail legally, that doesn't mean that Chill fails. It's like, if you can't storm the fortress, maybe you try to poison the well inside instead.
So the goal isn't actually winning the lawsuit itself. What is it then?
It's what's called process punishment. You file lawsuits, often flimsy ones, not really expecting to win, but just to inflict pain. Financial pain, administrative pain. Think about those suits against the Wall Street Journal or the Des Moines Register over election polling methods. Legally weak, maybe, but they succeed by draining resources, time, money, and they definitely encourage risk aversion. For a small local paper, just the cost of the discovery phase in a lawsuit, that could wipe out their entire annual profit. Easily.
So lose the legal battle, but win the war on resources and nerves. That sounds pretty cynical, but effective. It forces newsrooms to pause, to think twice before publishing something potentially controversial.
It absolutely does. And then there's another layer. Bypassing the courts altogether to what you might call bureaucratic chilling. Look at the Pentagon example. They didn't go to court. They just demanded journalists sign a pledge not to report even some unclassified information or risk losing their access credentials immediately.
That's striking. No judge, no jury needed. Just an immediate operational chokehold. Precisely. And that's how you move the Overton window, the range of what's considered acceptable public discourse. You impose these bureaucratic gags, these restrictions, and you shrink the space for criticism without ever needing a court order. It's a form of prior restraint, really, just done administratively.
And you can actually see the results of this chill, can't you? I remember reading that back in 2008, something like 92% of the biggest 100 U.S. newspapers endorsed a presidential candidate. But in the last big election cycle, 3/4 didn't endorse anyone. That's a huge shift. It really suggests this growing risk aversion, doesn't it? Where maybe silence feels like the safest option.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. There's another major angle here. It's not just lawsuits or bureaucratic pressure. It's about controlling the pipes, the infrastructure itself, this ownership plus leverage strategy.
That's right. You don't necessarily need a total monopoly, Berlusconi style, if you can strategically influence or acquire just a few critical nodes. A really current example is the whole TikTok U.S. divestiture situation. You see how the deal seems to be shaping up around this block led by Oracle and Silver Lake. That concentrates potential influence within a very small, very powerful, and potentially politically aligned group of investors.
That sounds less like normal market activity and more like acquiring influence on the cheap. Targeted influence over how information flows.
It certainly looks that way. And then there's the risk of what you might call conglomerate capture. We saw the potential flashpoint with David Ellison's bid for Paramount. A deal like that could potentially hand control over major news outlets, CBS, maybe even CNN, to a businessman seen as politically allied. That creates a huge concentration of media assets, potentially vulnerable to, let's say, political steering.
But the really big players, the tech giants, Alphabet, Meta, they control so much information flow. Surely they're too big to pressure effectively?
Too big for direct censorship, maybe, but incredibly vulnerable to political leverage. Think about it. These companies have enormous business interests, AI development, spectrum licenses, mergers, antitrust reviews that depend heavily on government goodwill. So the theory goes, they could be subtly induced through threats or maybe promises to tweak their platforms, to make sure YouTube or Instagram perhaps lean a certain way, or maybe just quietly deprioritize critical narratives.
So their basic duty to shareholders, keeping those core regulated businesses profitable, might actually compel them to, well, fall into line politically to avoid trouble.
That's the underlying fear, yes.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to that fragmentation we talked about earlier, the sprawling media market you praised as a defense.
Hang on, yeah, I did, but now you're saying it's actually highly vulnerable. That feels like a contradiction.
Well, it cuts both ways, and this is really the key nuance. Fragmentation makes total top-down control virtually impossible, yes. But it makes it much, much easier to flood the zone with coordinated narratives, with noise, and it also makes it easier to use algorithmic tweaks to just subtly demote a story or delay it or distract from it, rather than an outright ban. If you're a political actor, why bother trying to spike a story if you can just ensure almost nobody sees it?
So the objective changes. It's not about silencing completely, but about quietly steering the conversation or just drowning out critical voices with sheer volume. Okay, so the analysis here concludes that just giving up, being fatalistic, is the wrong approach. Given these shifting tactics, the process punishment, the bureaucratic chill, the ownership plays, what are the practical near-term defenses? What can newsrooms and maybe regulators actually do?
We need strategies that are, frankly, preemptive and aggressive. First, lawfare that bites back. Newsrooms have got to make better use of anti-SOTP laws. And crucially, they need to actively seek fees and sanctions when faced with these serial, meritless lawsuits.
Just to remind listeners, anti-SLAPP, that's strategic lawsuit against public participation, right? Laws designed to stop powerful entities from silencing critics through bogus, expensive lawsuits.
Exactly. Seeking sanctions flips the script. It makes the intimidation tactic expensive for the attacker. We saw that work in the New York Times case. It turns process punishment back on itself. Second, those bureaucratic gags, like the Pentagon's pledge, they need immediate challenge. Challenge them as unconstitutional prior restraint. Go for temporary restraining orders fast before these things become accepted practice.
And what about tackling the ownership influence?
Yeah.
Especially with these massive deals like TikTok, potentially concentrating power. How do you keep those key distribution points neutral?
That falls more to regulatory bodies, the FTC, the DOJ, the FCC. They need to start conditioning major media and tech deals. Put requirements in place, like governance firewalls, clear public interest commitments. We need more ownership sunlight. That means demanding transparency, maybe board-level disclosures. Whenever government actors get significantly involved in things like divestiture talks, like with TikTok now, the public needs to know who might be pulling the strings behind the scenes.
And the algorithmic manipulation, that quiet threat of demoting or distracting from news, how do you even fight that?
It's tough, but platform transparency is key. We should probably require the really big platforms, the very large online platforms, as the EU calls them, to maintain public archives. Archives detailing their rationales for downranking or removing political content. Think of it like a kind of due process transparency. It would make quiet pressure from governments much harder, because the platform's actions would have to be logged and justified publicly.
And one last thing, what's the immediate practical defense if a newsroom does face a direct takedown attempt or finds its content being throttled on a major platform?
Coalition redundancy. It sounds technical, but it's simple. Newsrooms need to have prearranged pacts, content mirroring agreements. Think of it like mutual defense. So if one outlet's investigation gets taken down or throttled, it's instantly syndicated, mirrored across dozens of other partner sites. It makes the takedown backfire by actually amplifying the story's reach.
That really sums up the main takeaway, I think. The danger isn't necessarily some kind of total Orwellian control over the media. It's more about achieving enough chill through intimidation and enough steering through ownership and platform pressure to skew the narrative just enough to influence things at the margins. And we know the margins are often where elections are decided, how public perception is shaped over time, how trust gets eroded.
Absolutely. And, even if America navigates this specific period of partisan press conflict, there might be a bigger, longer-term cost. It's this risk of the volatilization of the public square. If market forces and our fragmented attention spans mean all the rewards, the clicks, the money, the fame go towards divisive political entertainment, towards outrage, then building good government on some kind of common shared understanding of facts, that just gets harder and harder, maybe impossible.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.